Good good afternoon. Welcome to episode 28 of the Political Mike podcast. I have with me a very special guest, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Richard Haas, who's going to break down to me some of the developments that are happening in the world today as it relates to foreign policy. Dr. Richard Haas is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 18th year as the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. And for his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution in that region, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haas was director of policy planning for the State Department, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haas also served as U.S. coordinator for foreign policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. He has extensive additional governmental experience. From 1989 to 1993, he was special assistant to President George Herbert Walker Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haas holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctorate of philosophy degree from Oxford University. He has received numerous honorary degrees and was a member of the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and Hamilton College. He's also a regular guest on MSNBC's Morning Joe. Dr. Haas is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one book on management. His latest work, The World, A Brief Introduction, is a New York Times bestseller. Dr. Haas, it's such a privilege and honor to have you join me today. I wanted to open up the discussion by talking about what seems to be dominating the headlines a lot in terms of U.S. relations with Russia in this new administration. Specifically, Dr. Haas, how does President Biden's condemnation of the Russian government's cyber attack and the assassination attempt of Vladimir Putin's former political rival, Alexei Navalny, impact President Biden's proposal for a 5-year extension of the New START treaty?
Well, thanks for having me, Mike, first of all. And look, you start off with an important question, and it's difficult. Relations with Russia have multiple dimensions or personalities. There's still the necessity of managing the nuclear relationship, hence the desire to extend the so-called New START, the Nuclear Arms Control Agreement. At the same time, any number of things where we disagree. You mentioned their treatment of Mr. Navalny. More broadly, how they've reacted to the beating up of protesters, the jailing of thousands on the political protest, what they have done in Ukraine and are doing in Ukraine, what they have done and are doing in Georgia, their continued indiscriminate use of force in parts of the Middle East, and then there's the so-called Great Hack. So we've got a range of things we disagree with. And I think the challenge is, how do you carve out areas where there's some overlap in our interests, small, again, nuclear, possibly North Korea, possibly Iran, and at the same time, you push back on all the areas you disagree. And that could be with sanctions, it could be with words, it could be strengthening NATO, it could be selling arms to or giving arms to Ukraine. So it's a complicated relationship, but that to me is in some ways emblematic of this world we live in, where increasingly a lot of relationships are not one-dimensional or one-directional.
And so on pages 78 to 79 of your book, The World, A Brief Introduction, Dr. Haas, you articulate that the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a body that would consolidate and anchor newly liberated countries, served as a source of tension between the West and Vladimir Putin. Particularly in Yugoslavia, where NATO and Russia found themselves at odds on opposite ends of this issue. So with NATO providing political backing, you write, and military support for air assaults on Serbia during the Kosovo War that took place between 1998 and 1999. Russia was sympathetic to Serbia for political, cultural, religious reasons. But you say that NATO enlargement was an error, and the security concerns of Eastern European states could have been addressed by other means other than bringing them into NATO. In your view, sir, what are those other means, and what do they look like?
Okay, I'll get there. Just give me a minute to get there. I mean, I think NATO performed an invaluable role during the Cold War from the late 40s through the late 80s for 4 decades. It helped keep the peace. It's a principal reason the Cold War stayed cold. I think that was a sensational development. And I think the idea that at the end of the Cold War, you had a unified Germany, democratic, brought into NATO, I think made great sense. I think Germany was a special case. The question of NATO enlargement after the Cold War, look, I can't sit here, Mike, and say, had we not done it, things would have turned out just fine with Russia, given Mr. Putin, unlikely. But it seems to me this increased the odds that we would end up in a hostile relationship. You know, Churchill once said, in victory, magnanimity, be generous. I would argue that NATO enlargement was not generous. I thought there were things we could have offered the Russians, I once thought, argued in a role in NATO. Increasingly, NATO is an alliance where countries essentially decide what their relationship is. Or we had something called the Partnership for Peace. And this was a new set of security relations. It was created originally as an alternative to NATO. Included all the former Warsaw Pact countries. And you could have, the only thing you couldn't have in it was the symbolism of NATO. So I thought we gave them the substance of security without, once again, doing something that would be seen as hostile by Russia. So I thought we could have gotten 99% of the substance of NATO membership other ways. So to me, that was good enough. Again, but that debate is moot. We did what we did. We are where we are. I don't think now we ought to be expanding NATO further. We got our hands full with what we've got. We ought to be strengthening NATO, and we ought to be thinking about how do we deal with Russia, with a leader who gets up every morning and sees American foreign policy, sees the West as essentially hostile to his own continued rule.
So I wanted to ask you about another portion in your book. On page 80, you also say that the history suggests that sanctions can rarely alter what a government decides to do on issues of major importance. And you say this in reference to Russia's annexation of Crimea that took place in 2014, in which the United States and much of Europe dismissed as a sham. It dismissed it as a sham due to the fact that the referendum that took place occurred because there was an overwhelming population of Russian citizens living in that region.
But just to be clear, the reason it was a sham is that you had Russian troops there, so the entire process was carried out in this repressive environment. The Russian military entry was never necessary or warranted to begin with. This never should have happened. But anyhow, I interrupted.
Oh, no, thank you. And I just wanted to, if you can expound a little bit on why do you believe that history suggests that sanctions, right? Sanctions rarely alter what a government does.
Look, the reason is I've studied them. I've written several books about sanctions, and you're just hard pressed to see where they have that kind of a decisive impact. We use them all the time. And for most of the target countries, I would call sanctions part of the price of doing business. They are often willing to pay the price. Normally it's economic, could be a political price, because what they have done, they believe is essential. So they're willing, if you will, to absorb it. It's a tax on what they've done. And I think the problem is so often, we confront a situation we don't like. We want to, quote unquote, do something for all sorts of reasons, many of them good. We don't want to use military force. We don't want to do nothing. So sanctions become the tool of choice. So in virtually every situation where we're unhappy, we turn to them. And when you look around the world, in most instances, they haven't turned things around. Often they have unintended consequences. They can hurt general populations. They can often strengthen autocrats. By putting sanctions on, you often weaken markets. Well, guess what? That then strengthens the hand in many cases of an authoritarian government. I'm not against them per se. I just simply see them as a tool. And before we use them, we ought to think really hard. Do we want sanctions? If so, what kind of sanctions? What are the alternatives? And my own view is we're too quick to use them, and often again they have unintended consequences, or they're more symbolic than real. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that in many cases they're all that significant.
So this next question is actually pulled from another book from another author, Bob Woodward. Chapter 2 of his latest work, Rage. He recounts an exchange between then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and then President-elect Donald Trump. And during which this exchange, Tillerson explains to Trump that after having a conversation with Vladimir Putin, he realized that President Trump could deal with Putin while Obama was never able to. According to Woodward, Tillerson explained to Trump that Putin has a goal for Russia. They want recognition of their role in the global order, and Putin wants respect as a leader of a great country. He said, "We've never been willing to give him either, and now they view their role in the global order as equivalent to ours, the United States." I want to ask you, sir, in your view, do you think that this recognition of Russia as a major player is a necessary or legitimate concession to make in pursuit of the United States making efforts to thwart Russian aggression?
Well, I don't see it as a concession. I think to see Russia as a major country, certainly militarily, has nuclear weapons on a scale equal to ours. It has enormous conventional military forces. It has significant energy resources. It is a major power in the cyber arena. So Russia, it has a seat on the UN Security Council. Russia is a major power. Now, it's not a major power economically. It's a tiny economy. It's not a major power in many ways demographically. Russia's what, 1/9, 1/10 the population of China. So that seems to me simply to recognize reality. And let me just make a larger point, Mike. I don't see diplomacy. I don't see the day-to-day of foreign policy, whether it's with Russia or anybody else, as a favor. Look, we should be talking to the Russian government, whether it's Putin or people below him. It's not a favor. It's not a compromise. That's simply another tool. That's part of the arsenal, if you will, of American foreign policy. We just talked about sanctions. There's military force. There's intelligence. So sure, we should talk to Russia privately at times, sometimes publicly, where there might be areas where we agree. There's obviously going to be areas more often where we disagree. So be it. But for American diplomats to meet with their Russian counterparts, that to me is exactly right. One of the things that does is often it clears up areas where they may not exactly understand what it is we care about and why. I'm a great believer in clearing that up. I don't know if it'll change their behavior, but at least they won't miscalculate. If they do X, and they know from conversations with us, if they do X, we're going to do Y. At least they can factor that into their thinking. They may ignore what we say we're going to do. So be it. Then we can decide how we want to react. But I like the back and forth. I don't think that's a concession to Russia or North Korea or Iran or anybody else when we do it.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and go to the Middle East. Is it possible, in your view, for the United States to get back into a nuclear agreement with Iran in the foreseeable future after President Trump unilaterally took the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal?
The answer is maybe. Both sides have to both want it in principle and have to be able to negotiate it in practice. Both sides now have said they are willing to go back to the 2015 agreement. We can put aside whether that's desirable from our point of view. So look, this administration has made the decision it's desirable. Can they get from here to there? I don't know. You have to work out the sequencing. And there's also the fact that there are many sanctions the United States has introduced against Iran, only some of which are because of their nuclear activity. Many of the sanctions we've introduced are in response to their human rights actions, their support for terrorism, their arming of various militias, what they're doing, say, in Syria or Yemen or Lebanon. So we could remove some of the sanctions if we so chose to deal with the nuclear, but all sorts of sanctions would remain. And it's not clear, based on what the foreign minister has said, that would be acceptable to Iran. So I'm not sure the two countries can find if you will, the detailed formula to get back in the 2015 agreement. And even if they do, no one should have any misunderstanding. That agreement doesn't solve the challenge or problem or threat of Iranian nuclear activity. It simply parks it for a while. And gradually over time, over the next 5, 10, however many years, Iran increasingly is freed up to do what it wants in the nuclear realm with centrifuges, with enriched uranium and the like. So at most, the agreement buys you some years, but no more than that.
And so, if you do get into another nuclear deal with Iran, do you see the position of the Iranians still allowing the IAEA inspectors to have unfettered access to its nuclear facilities? Is that off the table, or
Well, it has to be on the table. It'd be ridiculous to get into a deal with Iran without comprehensive inspections. It's the only assurance you have that whatever the deal's terms are being met. So to me, that's not something to be negotiated away. That's something to be insisted on. Any deal without that is not worth the paper it's written on.
So, in regards to Saudi Arabia, sir, the acknowledgement of the planning and prior knowledge of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, do you see that as the first step in which the Biden administration cannot compromise in order to resume some kind of or pursue some kind of normal relations with that region?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that for the following reason. What happened, happened. We can't bring Mr. Khashoggi back to life, unfortunately. So the question is, what's your definition of satisfaction now? What is it we're asking the Saudi government to do? Because we're unlikely to get a situation, let me put it that way, where all those who are involved will be brought to justice, because that involves quite likely senior levels of the Saudi government. So the question is for the Biden administration is what is it that would give us satisfaction? What box do we want the Saudis to check? That's one of the areas. We've also got the problem with what they're doing in Yemen. Again, what is it we want them to do? We've got broader human rights concerns in Saudi Arabia. They're arresting lots of women and other activists. Now, we've obviously got some shared concerns about Iran. So I think the real challenge for the administration, which has so far been critical on the human rights side and has held up some arms deliveries, is what is it going to ask Saudi Arabia to do? And what is it prepared to do if they do it? What is it prepared to do if they refuse to do it? That's the essence of the policy. And it's a tough question in the case of Mr. Khashoggi, because you are not going to get, I believe, you're not going to get a statement or a policy response that would, from our point of view, it's hard for me to see how it's adequate. So then the question is, how do you maintain perhaps a more limited relationship?
Mm-hmm.
But how do you maintain a more limited relationship given what this reveals about this leadership of Saudi Arabia? But there's still a case, it seems to me, given energy and given Iran and so forth, to maintain a relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think it illustrates a larger problem. We talked about Russia, we haven't talked about China, but in many of these countries, we have strategic concerns, we have economic concerns, and we've got political and human rights concerns. And on the political human rights side, in many of these cases, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, Turkey, we're frustrated, to say the least. We profoundly disagree.
Right.
So the question is, how do you take that into account? At the same time, you have this larger relationship with strategic and economic interests where we have real stakes. And when I used to teach foreign policy, you mentioned it when you introduced me, when I used to teach it at Harvard and at Hamilton, I used to say, the good news about foreign policy is it's interesting because of questions like this. The bad news, it's hard. These are hard questions, how to get this right.
So, sir, what do you think becomes of the agreement that occurred between Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, and the United States under the Trump administration, where the U.S. agreed to help Saudi Arabia beat back the Iranians and support Saudi ambitions to become a dominant player in the Middle East, in exchange for MBS and Saudi Arabia to promise to help the U.S. resolve the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and to acknowledge Israel's legitimacy as a nation. Where do you think? What do you think happens with that agreement now that we're in
Well,
a new?
I'm not sure I'd call that an agreement. There may or may have not been strategic understandings along those lines. There's no formal agreement along those lines, to the best of my knowledge. Look, I think the United States and Saudi Arabia, it's kind of what I just said. There's areas where we have some overlap in interests, say on concern about Iran. We don't necessarily agree all the time on how to deal with it. We have certain overlapping interests on energy. Potentially, we could have some overlapping interests in vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinian problem. I can imagine where Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, like Bahrain, might, under certain circumstances, normalize its relations with Israel. That would be an extraordinarily positive step. They could do so in a way, by the way, that might jumpstart negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. That would obviously be welcome. So those are all areas where the United States and Saudi Arabia have some potential or actual agreement. And
Right.
again, the question is, how do we navigate those given the areas where we disagree? And I think what you're probably going to end up with, Mike, is a relationship, almost what I said about Russia, what I would say about China. These are not all or nothing relationships. These are relationships. It's almost, if these were people we were talking about, we would say these are complicated. They have multiple personalities, but that's increasingly what we're dealing with, where it's very hard to put these countries in a box where they're just foes or they're just friends. There's a lot of in between. And it puts a real premium on foreign policy, on diplomacy. But that's my guess is that's where we are with a country like Saudi Arabia, is how do we manage this relationship where we have both areas of strategic overlap and areas of real strategic difference.
So I have a question. What about the arms sales deal? In this new administration, now that we've experienced a transition of power, what do you think, the Biden administration's stance would be in terms of these negotiations now?
Well, it's always hard to make predictions. What this administration or any administration will do, and I tend not to do that. For the honest answer is I don't know. My guess is what they are going to require, though, is some kind of assurances that if arms are going to be provided, you have what are called end-use provisions. It's not, it's something that we often do with countries where we say, we'll give you this technology, but only under the following conditions. They can only be used against these countries or in these scenarios and so forth. So my guess is if we give arms to Saudi Arabia, there will be certain end-use conditions, possibly limiting what they could be used for vis-a-vis Yemen or something like that.
So in China, Trump's steel tariffs, how far do you think, or if it does at all, set the United States back in terms of relations with that region, the Pacific Rim? Does that complicate relationships even more for the Biden administration going into the next 4 years?
Well, look, I have very little enthusiasm for tariffs to begin with. And so my guess is a lot of the tariffs will ultimately be removed, but there's going to have to be as part of a larger package. But these tariffs, are being paid for by American consumers, either directly or indirectly, when businesses have to pay higher prices. So I'm not a big fan of the previous administration's trade policy. We've yet to see what this administration's trade policy will be. I don't hear a lot of talk about it, which, to be honest, is a little bit of concern to me. I would love to see the United States get into the Asia-Pacific trade arrangements that have emerged. There's several out there. I think they'd be of great help to us economically as well as strategically. I think we're making a major mistake by not participating in what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now it's called the CPTPP and so forth. So I would like to see us have, once again, a forward-leaning trade relationship, and I hope that comes to pass.
So recently, Chinese Ambassador Zhang Ming welcomed President Biden's decision to re-enter the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Accords. and the World Health Organization. If you were in the Biden administration, in President Biden's ear, where would you advise him to be like low-hanging fruit to have U.S. and Chinese relationships resume or move towards a progressive track of normalcy?
Well, again, what I said about Saudi Arabia and Russia applies here. You're never going to get to the point where it's going to be a simple relationship where it's going to be all good. Not going to happen. Too many fundamental differences. So what we want to do is see if we can find some areas, which was your question, where our interests might overlap. But at the same time, we've got to push back where our interests clearly don't. So we're going to push back about Hong Kong, push back about their mistreatment of the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs. We're going to push back where we see them stealing intellectual property. We're going to push back where they assert unilateral privileges or legal claims in the South China Sea, or I could go on. Long list of areas we're going to push back. That said, we obviously want to enlist their help in dealing with North Korea's nuclear missile programs. China borders on Afghanistan. They could play a significant role there. We obviously want China to play a much more responsible role than it has played over the last couple of years on climate issues or on health issues. So in that sense, I would say we want to have a wide-ranging relationship. We want to have a serious dialogue with China, but we should have no illusions. This is a very assertive China. It's more repressive at home, and we're going to have real differences. So we're going to have to try to figure out how do we push back in all these areas where we must. At the same time, we don't preclude cooperation where it's where it's essentially in our interest. Again, this will be diplomatically challenging, but it's the only way to try to proceed. Then it's up to China to decide, will it act with restraint in areas like Taiwan or the South China Sea and so forth, and we'll just have to see.
So the events that took place on January 6th at the Capitol building, in your view, how does the Biden administration craft a message to condemn what took place in Myanmar, the coup that just occurred, in which the duly elected leader now seems to have to be in hiding? How do we come up with a message in light of what happened in our own country, with white nationalists storming the Capitol building with the Confederate flag?
Well, it's an appropriate question. It's an awkward question, and there's no easy way to answer it. It clearly weakens our standing. I just tweeted about it, and I talked about what the Russians were doing against Navalny or what the military was doing against the election, against the government in Myanmar. And I said it's very hard to talk the talk if you don't walk the walk. And in January 6th, in the whole handling of the aftermath of the elections and earlier behaviors over the last few years, the United States has not walked the walk. And so what we have to do is gradually reclaim our legitimacy in this area. And the only way to do it is through performance. So those who violated the law on January 6th need to be brought to justice. We need to show that the legal system works. We need to make sure that something like this, to the extent we can, does not happen again. We need to make sure that all those who have the right to vote are able to vote. We may need to look, we need to look at all aspects essentially of the functioning of our democracy. And I think if we're lucky, January 6th and what came before and afterwards will be a wake-up call. And it will alert us all as Americans where we'll say, gee, we can't take our democracy for granted. We have got to, I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. If we want to have a foreign policy in this area, we've got to begin it at home. And we've got to strengthen American democracy. We've got to, when the Constitution was written, the line was, in order to form a more perfect union. Well, we've got a ways to go, but we've got to go in that direction. We've got to improve this union of ours, not for foreign policy reasons, though that'll be a bonus. We got to improve it for the 330 million Americans living here at home. If this society is going to function, if we're going to meet our domestic challenges, if violence is not going to become even more pronounced than it is now. So we have enormous challenges here at home, which I believe we need to meet. before we're going to have a credible voice. We shouldn't kid ourselves, though. The rest of the world was shocked by January 6th. Those images are going to linger. So, it's what, I don't know if anyone's ever said this to you. People have said it to me as an individual. You can lose your reputation in a minute, but it takes a lifetime to build one. Same thing for a country. It takes a lifetime for a country to build a reputation. It took one day, January 6th, for us to burn it. Well, it's going to take now, I think, many, many years to regain respect for and confidence in the United States.
And the Biden administration seems to be holding back on whether or not the U.S. is going to formally participate in the 2021 Olympic Games. In your view, is that a strategic move, or, and if so, if it is, could you explain to the viewers what could be the possible rationale behind that?
Well, I mean, with the Olympics, the main concern I would think is COVID related. I mean, you've got a public health, about whether it's safe. Putting that aside, the political considerations, I think there's other ways to, if you've got political issues. I'm not a big fan of asking these young people who have trained their whole lives for this moment to sacrifice themselves for this kind of symbolic stuff. So I tend to favor participation in Olympic Games and look for other ways to carry out foreign policy. I also like it when Americans go abroad and they don't just do well athletically, but they act well. I think it makes a great statement for our society. And a lot of these young, not all of them, but a lot of these young people are really quite remarkable. So I lean against using the Olympics as a way to demonstrate displeasure with another government, or, if you will, to sanction them. I think there's better ways.
So as we're landing the plane here, sir, I wanted to ask you about Cuba. President Trump's reversal of the Obama policy to open up to Cuba. Will that result in the Cuban government, especially with Raul Castro stepping down now after 62 years, I believe, so that'll be after 62 years of Castro brother rule. Will the Cuban government now turn to Russia and China as a result?
I see no sign that the Cuban system is about to evolve in a meaningful way. It's Castroism, or call it communism, or call it whatever you will, is institutionalized there for the foreseeable future. So the personnel at the top may change, but the system is unlikely to in any meaningful way. I hope at some point that changes, and we do see meaningful political and social and economic change in Cuba. I think the country underperforms in many ways because of what's in existence. But in the meantime, we don't see the changes at home, and we see Cuba, among other things, being the foundation for the regime, the Maduro regime in Venezuela. So, again, I'd be open to a different relationship, but it would have to be very carefully structured, step by step. And we shouldn't do things on the hope that somehow it will lead to different change. We should carry this forward very transactionally, I would argue. So I'm not wildly optimistic about the scope for a meaningful improvement in U.S.-Cuban ties. Love to be proven wrong, but at the moment, I don't see a lot of grounds for being wildly optimistic.
So you had mentioned Venezuela, but do you think that the Trump sanctions on Venezuela exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in that region?
Well, I think the bulk of the humanitarian crisis is because of what the regime has done. I would simply say our sanctions probably added to it, and they clearly didn't add to the weakening of the regime. That regime entrenched, in part because of Cubans, we just mentioned, in part because of Russians, in part because of Chinese, in part because of its own efforts, in part because the opposition is extraordinarily divided. So I think the sad reality is that is probably going to be the regime and the system in Venezuela for some time to come. And I'm not an expert on it, but then I think the question is, okay, in the short run, there probably is not a chance to displace the regime. So then the question is, what's an intelligent policy? What would make a bad situation less bad? And that might be the way we need to think about it inside Venezuela. And obviously, there's millions of people who have left Venezuela. many of whom are in Colombia, some of whom are in other countries. And the question is, what more can we do for them? How do we ease the humanitarian hardship of these individuals? How do we ease the burden on the countries they've gone to? And what can we do to somewhat improve the lot of the millions of Venezuelans who are still in the country? But at the moment, I don't see the pieces there, Mike, to bring about a fundamental change in the reality. Sad to say.
So, in terms of Belarus, before the United States and the debacle that happened on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January, the latest election chaotic news was in Belarus. But Belarus currently borders three NATO countries, three NATO members. I'm sorry, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. So Belarus and Russia entered I believe, a state union in which they were partnering with each other. In your view, should the United States recognize that state union, and should NATO bolster its capabilities in that region?
Well, look, I don't think we should recognize any special Russian position in Belarus. I see no reason for it. I think NATO should be across the board bolstering its capabilities. There is a Russian threat. There are other threats as well, in area and out of area. NATO ought to look hard, not just at what it spends, but how it spends it. I would say the whole is less than the sum of its parts. Too much of NATO's spending is not sufficiently integrated or coordinated. So the answer is not simply to bang NATO members over the head with a big stick that says spend more. It might be spend smarter. But so sure, we ought to be strengthening across the board, and we ought not to recognize any special Russian role, what the French would call a droit de regard, in Belarus.
So my very last question for the afternoon actually is a domestic policy related question in regards to President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, also known as the American Rescue Plan. 10 lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, reportedly met with the president today. Jen Psaki, the press secretary, came out and said, look, the president is all for bipartisanship, but he's on the terms that he set for the floor is that you have to meet me more than I have to meet you halfway. In your view, sir, do you see that as effective going forward, especially in the early days of this administration? So much is on the line, and you're really setting the tone for what's to come in the next 2 years, really.
Look, I would like there to be an agreement across party lines and across the executive congressional line. I think it'd be good for the country. My own view is the $1.9 trillion package is much larger and less focused than it needs to be. Now, the $600 billion Republican alternative is arguably smaller than it needs to be. That's why God created compromises. Whether the two sides are willing and able to reach a compromise, I don't know. It's essential, though, that we build up greater capacity above all to deal with COVID and to help. I would target it on businesses in particular to help them get through. I think some of the more general dispersal of funds is not warranted. And I think we also, it's a longer conversation, but we need to keep some of our powder dry. Interest rates are still very low. Government debt is exceedingly high. I don't want to have a situation in a couple of years where the economy, well, let me put it this way, I do want to have the situation in a couple of years, and it's going to happen in a couple of months, I think, where the economy comes roaring back. That's going to happen regardless of this package. I think there's a lot of pent up strength in our economy that as soon as COVID gets under control, that'll come back. So my instincts would be to focus on what you need to do to accelerate the management of COVID. And I think a lot of the economy will take care of itself. I think there's a certain danger in overstimulating the economy now. The word inflation is almost never used anymore, but the laws of economics have not expired to the best of my knowledge. So I just think we need to be mindful. My instincts are, I know a lot of people are seeing this as trying to apply the lessons of 2007 and 8 and not under-respond, but I'm not sure now that these situations are sufficiently analogous where a package of this scale, 1.9 trillion, is required, and the president has signaled his willingness to compromise. So I would love to see a demonstration of ability and willingness of the White House, Democrats on the Hill, Republicans on the Hill, to find some common ground. I think substantively and symbolically it would be good. Whether that's possible, I don't know. And if not, obviously the president has other, and the Democratic majority in the Congress has other vehicles. But I think we've had too much one party governing in this country. And I was critical, before anyone gets on my case, I'm not being hypocritical. I was critical of it when it happened with Republicans. And I'm uncomfortable now that it's happening with Democrats. So if we could actually have a degree of bipartisanship across, again, party and institutional lines, it would be a good thing. I think this, not just economically, but I think would be a good thing politically.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haas. And you have to forgive me, but I have one burning question. Trump's removal from office, do you think that's indicative of a worldwide move towards, move away from, I guess, totalitarian regimes, strong men,
No,
like that?
I don't. I think it's basically, well, he got removed through the ballot box. I don't believe the Senate will convict him of impeachment. No, I think what it shows is that people in power who perform poorly during COVID are vulnerable. So whether it's him or the leadership in other countries that have performed badly, the leadership suffers politically. Could happen in Brazil, Mexico, and so forth. And where the leadership performs well, it gets rewarded. And so I think it's as simple as that. So if Mr. Trump had performed better on COVID, I actually believe he would have been reelected. But he performed terribly. Alas, we've paid an enormous human price for it, with 450,000 dead, and in terms of an economic price. But he himself paid a political price. And I think that's the lesson, that incumbents are held responsible. And if good things happen on their watch, they get rewarded. If bad things happen on their watch, they got penalized. In his case, bad things happened on his watch and he got penalized.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haas. This was an amazing discussion. I really enjoyed it. I want to remind my viewers again, the book is The World, A Brief Introduction. It was published May of last year, 2020, I believe. So
2020 is last year. You're right.
So please go ahead. This is a must-have on your bookshelf. It explains, it breaks down United States multilateral agreements in such a simple way. Dr. Haas, thank you so much. It was a privilege and honor to have you join me today on the Political Mic. With that being said,
Mike. Thanks for asking me. Take care of yourselves.
Yes, sir. I'm going to go ahead and end the episode 28 of the Political Mic broadcast. Thank you all for viewing.